Hello everybody. Welcome to the second presentation in our Southern Ocean Stories programme of online talks by the South Georgia Heritage Trust and the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust. Thank you for joining us today. My name's Alison and I'm the Chief Executive of the South Georgia Heritage Trust. My co-host is Camilla Nichol, who's the CEO of the UK Antarctic Heritage Trust. This evening's topic is The Whale's Tale. Our three speakers are all going to explore the tumultuous story of the whale in the Southern Ocean from the perspectives of science, history and conservation. Any questions for speakers can be sent to everyone by typing them into the Q&A box, and when the talks are done, the panel will come back to you on those questions. Our first speaker will be Professor Bjørn Basberg, a professor in economic history at the Norwegian School of Economics in Bergen, and Bjørn's also a trustee of SGHT. Bjørn will be followed by Dr. Jennifer Jackson, who's a senior research scientist at British Antarctic Survey, who's organised 4 research expeditions to study whales at South Georgia. Our final speaker is Ted Cheeseman. Ted has helped people to explore South Georgia and the Antarctic for 25 years and is co-founder of Happy Whale, an app which encourages tourists to contribute to science by uploading their photos of whale sightings. Following their talks, we'll have a Q&A session with questions through the chat box before we hand over to Camilla for some final words. Now, these talks are free, as you know, but we would like to ask you to consider supporting our charities and through them, heritage and environmental conservation work that helps us to better understand and protect our wonderful whales. Thank you in advance for your support. Now over to our first presenter, who is Bjørn.
Okay, let's get this thing to work then. Okay, that should be it. And the sound is okay, I hope. So, well, thank you very much for this opportunity to talk about the whaling, history of whaling, I should say, which is a favorite topic. So the background for this talk is a paper that I'm working on really for a history conference. And the main topic of that conference is history of oceans. And I thought I'd better find an ocean to explore, of course. So I decided on the Ross Sea. This is probably an unnecessary map for this audience, but here it is, defined by the coasts and circled in red, obviously, defined by the coasts in the east and west, the ice shelf to the south, and the Southern Ocean to the north. And it's also placed here in what you could call a political context, which is the green Ross dependency. So being a whaling historian, my perspective and my interest for the Ross Sea is its role for Antarctic whaling and how the industry played a role for the geopolitics there. And I've studied other areas and other aspects of whaling and whaling history, but never really the Ross Sea, although it has had a special aura all through my life, I would say. I grew up in Sandefjord, Norway, with whaling ships like this in the harbor between the Antarctic seasons. And I even walked to my school along the Rosshavsgaten, the Ross Sea Street, for many years. But the human history, obviously, is very much about Sir James Clark Ross himself, and his expedition's discovery of this sea in 1841 was important for any aspects of the further development of this area. It led to further expeditions. It defined what became the main gateway toward the pole. It was important for the political development, and it was important for the development of Antarctic whaling. By its many encounters and the reports on whales. And one quote is here: "We have discovered not only new land, but a valuable whale fishery well worthy the attention of our enterprising merchants." So several nations were involved in this search, and the Norwegians were very active right from the start. Exemplified here by the very first expedition in search of whaling grounds. It was the Antarctic, after the ship Antarctic expedition in 1894 and 95, sponsored by the Norwegian whaling pioneer Sven Foyn. Not that it never had any political consequence, really, but it led to a heated public debate between the expedition members about who was the first to set foot on land there. Was it Captain Christensen? Was it the expedition leader Bull? Was it the expedition member Karsten Borchgrevink? Or was it the New Zealand sailor Alexander von Tonselman? So it was sort of a New Zealand-Norwegian rivalry as well. But more important, this region became a center for a British rivalry, I would say, about the exploration of the interior and the route to the pole. And this rivalry at a late stage, one could say, also became and was turned into a well-known Norwegian-British rivalry, of course. Illustrated here by this very iconic photo showing the encounter between Scott's Terra Nova and Amundsen's Fram along the ice shelf when they had arrived and prepared for their southern journey the next season. So none of these very early expeditions led in any direct way to territorial annexations, although all expeditions, of course, they waved their flags and made claims in the area. But this was really left to the next stage in the exploration of the Ross Sea, and that was associated with the whaling plans. Shows really how whaling and politics in this area was very interwoven and linked. And a crucial person was for this development was this gentleman, Captain Carl Anton Larsen, an Antarctic pioneer from the 1890s, and of course the main initiator of whaling at South Georgia from 1904. Larsen retired from South Georgia in 1914, and he tried to be a farmer in Norway for some years, but that obviously did not or was not his favorite occupation, and he started to work on plans that had matured for some years, and that was about whaling in the Ross Sea. So the company AS Rosshavet, or Rosshavet Limited, was established in April of 1923, and a whaling fleet went south later that year. Illustrated here by another iconic photo, at least for a whaling historian, of James Clark Ross, the factory ship, and catchers navigating through the ice into the open Ross Sea, and this is in December of 1923. But into what political landscape did they navigate? Well, only about 5 months before, on the 30th of July, the Ross Dependency had been formally established by a British order under the administration of the New Zealand government. And that was really more than 3 months after the company had been established. And in fact, half a year after the company had received a whaling license from the British government. So this chronology is quite interesting. I've been fortunate to have access to the extensive archives of the former Rosshavet company that also contains correspondence between Mr. Larsen, the Norwegian government, and also with British officials, of course. So when the planning of this company started back in 1922, the British sovereignty had not been declared. But the Norwegian diplomats and the Norwegian politicians, they saw no reason to disturb what was a very good relationship with Britain, and advised Mr. Larsen to apply for a license anyway. And Britain, issuing a license, they obviously did not object in doing so. So this whaling license was issued on the 21st of December, and the 22nd of December, which is shown in this document here, the invitation to subscribe for shares in this company was signed, as we can see here. So then after 7 months, the Ross dependency was established. So was the British annexation just a reaction to these whaling initiatives? Well, several historians have drawn a parallel to what happened at South Georgia less than 20 years before. Like the Norwegian historian Bjørn in his history of Norwegian foreign policy. And he writes, and I quote, "As with Britain's first annexation in Antarctica in 1906, the second one in 1923 came as a reaction to a Norwegian commercial initiative." Well, some of you may have noticed that he got things wrong here. The correct year should be 1908. That's when the letter patent was signed for South Georgia, and the commercial initiative was really, at least formally, an Argentine one, although it was in a reality Norwegian initiative, of course. Then New Zealand historians have also, not surprisingly, worked actively on these issues, and one of them, Malcolm Templeton, has remarked in one of his writings, not surprisingly, Norwegian historians have seen the creation of the Ross Sea dependency entirely as a reaction to the application of C.H. Larsen. Well, I'm trying to find a middle ground here. It seems to me that there is no doubt that the Order of Council of July 1923 was pushed forward by the whaling plans. It was a trigger, as historians would say. But historians also like to make a distinction between such short-term explanations and then the more deeper long-term explanations. And in that perspective, it is obvious that the British plans went further back than Larsen's plans. It was about imperial ambitions, about annexing the entire Antarctic continent that had been on the drawing board in the British government for quite some time already when Larsen started. So what consequences did the annexation have for the whalers? Well, not many really. Whaling just continued. Larsen had his license already. But throughout the 1920s, both the Norwegian whaling community and the Norwegian government, they challenged the claim and they questioned how it should be interpreted and what effects it would have on the whaling interest. So that became the important issue seen from Norway in the latter part of the 1920s. And the Norwegian ambassador in London put it this way in a letter to the British Foreign Minister Chamberlain in 1924, and I quote, "It does not at the present moment appear quite clear to my government that what the orders implies. My government cannot overlook the fact that the annexation in question may have the effect of jeopardizing present or future Norwegian interests and rights." So what was not quite clear to the Norwegians here? Well, in short, it was about three issues, as illustrated here. One issue was regarding the what could be called the polar plateau. And the Norwegians held up Roald Amundsen, of course, and the old hero even wrote a letter to the government where he sort of stated what they had claimed back there in 1911 and 1912. And they called this area Kong Haakon the Seventh, that was the king of Norway, plateau and Amundsen route. It was also an issue how the ice shelf, or the ice barrier, as they called it at the time, should be interpreted or understood. Was it land or was it sea? So in a way, it was a very, it turned out to become a very interesting sort of discussion on how a natural phenomenon should be understood in a political context in a way. And the third issue was the ocean and also undiscovered islands. And the Norwegian questioned the extent of the dependency and the undiscovered islands, which was what was relevant to the whaling industry, of course. Well, it turned out that none of these objections, they had any practical consequences at all. And it also turned out quite soon, really, that the Ross Sea and the Ross dependency became less and less relevant for the Norwegian whalers at the time. The focus shifted, and the keyword here is Dronning Maud Land in the further up the coast, so to speak, of the Antarctic continent. So I call this slide from the Ross Sea to Dronning Maud Land, illustrated here by the Norwegian research vessel. So another Norwegian whaling entrepreneur of the 1920s was Lars Christensen, and as many others, his companies had been operating in the Falkland Island dependencies, but were increasingly worried about the future of the whaling licenses there. So first he turned his attention to the West Antarctica between the Ross dependency and the Falkland Island dependencies, and inquired about a license there, mentioning specifically an island called Dougherty Island. And that island later turned out not to exist at all. And the entire sector was never really claimed by Britain or anyone else. But Christensen wanted to be on the safe side, as he wrote, and approached this very much the same way as, well, he soon dropped these plans and turned instead his attention to the East Antarctica, where he, over several years, sponsored expeditions to explore new whaling grounds, and the Norwegian was one of them. And there were other vessels that we used as well. And he also, of course, gradually made territorial claims for Norway. And to make a long story very short, this led to the Norwegian annexation of Dronning Maud Land in 1939. But by then, the whaling industry looked very different from the early 1920s. The first whalers that came into the Ross Sea, Larsen, and there were several other companies from 1923, they were pioneers in what has been called the pelagic whaling, which meant that they were independent of shore station or shore facilities. And this took off really in the mid-1920s, and in many ways it followed, or the whalers followed in the wake of Mr. Christensen along the coast towards the west. And by the early 1930s, a whaling ground map of the Antarctic looked like this. A handful of expeditions still operated in Ross Sea, as you can see from the slide here, with or without a whaling license. And a vast majority of the international whaling fleet, they now operated outside Endemol Land. Now that was now from 1933, the Australian sector, and also up towards Dronning Maud Land, and even all the way around to the Falkland Islands or the South Georgia area. So, and this is my conclusion really, the Ross Sea whaling was really a short intermezzo between the very extensive whaling in the Falkland Islands dependencies, South Georgia, South Shetland Islands in a very early period. And then the focus moved halfway around the continent really to the Ross Sea, and then moved again up to East Antarctica in the later period. Okay, so this was my review. Thank you.
Bjørn, thank you so much. That was fascinating. Really, really interesting. Everyone, please do ask your questions and use the Q&A. I noticed there have been a couple of hands up because we haven't got the chat function working. If you do have a question, please pop it in the Q&A and someone will answer it straight away for you. Okay, next up, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Jennifer Jackson, who's a research scientist at the British Antarctic Survey, who's been working an awful lot on whale science and particularly the recovery of whales in South Georgia. So delighted to welcome you. So Jennifer, please take it away.
Thanks very much. 1 second. Hopefully you can all see my slides. Great. Okay, so I'm going to talk to you today about the research of myself and my colleagues on the return of whales to South Georgia Island. This work has been very kindly supported by quite a few organisations, including the Darwin Initiative, BEST, EU BEST, Friends of South Georgia Island, World Wildlife Fund, South Georgia Heritage Trust, and it's had valuable logistical support from the government of South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands. So modern whaling in the Southern Hemisphere was particularly intense. And of course, you were just hearing from Bjørn about the particulars of what was going on in the Ross Sea. At the level of the whole Southern Hemisphere, over 2 million whales were killed between 1904 and the 1970s. And you can see that of those 2 million, a significant portion of those whales were killed in South Georgia, a tiny island in the South Atlantic. Over 176,000 whales were killed at South Georgia, making that an epicenter for modern whaling, particularly in the early whaling period between 1904 to the 1930s. The percentage of catch at South Georgia relative to the entire Southern Hemisphere was considerable. It was more than 10% of the entire Southern Hemisphere catch for blue whales, fin whales, humpbacks, and southern right whales. And you can see over 87,000 fin whales were taken, 42,000 blue whales. Let's look at the pattern of catches now. So this is a graph showing the catches through time for these different species. So you can see that humpback whales were taken first. That's the top graph. And then blue whales and fin whales, the whalers were moving further offshore. And then sei whales were caught a bit more in the 1950s when they'd run out of larger whales. And for the whole of the 20th century, southern right whales were actually not whaled that heavily at all. That's because they had been exploited mainly in the early 19th century, and their numbers were down so low that they were mostly protected and rarely seen during the main modern whaling period. So why is South Georgia such an important place for whales? This map orients you to the South Atlantic. You can see South Georgia in the circle there. It sits in the Scotia Sea, and it sits just north of the Antarctic circumpolar front. So that Antarctic circumpolar current that goes around the Southern Ocean, South Georgia is almost wrapped in that front on 3 sides. It's a subpolar location. It's a marine biodiversity hotspot. It's one of the highest areas of marine biodiversity in the Southern Ocean. And Antarctic krill are transported into South Georgia from the peninsula and other areas of the Weddell Sea on these currents. And then effectively, the large quantities of krill support huge amounts of krill predators. That is large numbers of penguins, seals, and of course, whales. Our primary focus in studying whales at South Georgia was initially the southern right whale. Now, as I mentioned, it has been heavily exploited and there weren't many for the 20th century, but it was a species that was regularly being reported by mariners and visitors to South Georgia for decades before we began our surveys. They were very heavily exploited, and in the South Atlantic, they were exploited since the 1600s. And more recently, dead calves have been seen very regularly stranding on their calving ground at Peninsula Valdez in Argentina. So we knew that there were some health concerns about this population, and we wanted to understand more about the feeding area where this southern right whale population was going and to see how well they were doing there. Along the way, of course, we made the absolute most of every whale observation opportunity. So we managed to gather a lot of useful information on humpback whales and also blue whales. And I'm going to talk primarily about these 3 species today. So just to orient you, South Atlantic whale migration patterns. Whales migrate, so seasonally they'll go to nice, warm, sheltered wintering grounds to have calves and to breed. And in feeding areas, they go to high latitudes where there's high levels of oceanic productivity. So I've got a circle there on the map showing where South Georgia sits. Here are humpback whales. They've got wintering grounds off Brazil and off West Africa, and there's their feeding area. The Western South Atlantic population is mostly associated with South Georgia. Southern right whales calve further south, so they're known off Brazil, southern Brazil and Argentina and Uruguay in the west, and off South Africa and also slightly off Namibia in the east. And they also feed off South Georgia and to the east. Finally, blue whales, which we're going to talk about today. We know that they fed at South Georgia because they were whaled really heavily there, but we don't really know much about their breeding grounds in the South Atlantic because they're just not seen. So we know that they're offshore, but we don't have much more information than that. I organised 4 surveys in 3 years. It took an enormous amount of other people's efforts to make that possible, but we managed to get a yacht on Song of the Whale yacht in 2018, and that was our first survey. So we were mostly spending our time surveying the north coast of South Georgia, mostly close to the coast. In 2019, the Camilla, that's the Convention for the Commission for the Conservation of Antarctic Marine Living Resources, they did a big synoptic krill surveying, and I was able to help put a team of marine mammal observers onto that vessel, and they did broad scale surveys of South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands. In the same year, myself and my team were on powerboats operating at King Edward Point Station at South Georgia and testing to see if it was feasible to do whale research at close quarters in coastal waters. And then finally, last year, my team went down and did the biggest whale survey to date on the Braveheart, and they went around the island a couple of times and did over 1,000 kilometers of effort. So we do a variety of science in order to make the absolute most of every survey opportunity down in South Georgia. Firstly, finding whales. We use observers, skilled marine mammal observers standing on a high place with binoculars to try and spot the whales as we're out. We also use acoustics. So we use diaphragm sonobuoys. These are direction finding sonobuoys. They get put in the water. You can see on the left there, Emily, putting a sonobuoy into the water. And then if a whale is calling, the sonobuoy will detect the whale and it will transmit that information to an antenna on our ship. And for a few hours, we'll get information about not only what species of whales are calling, here's Susie on the right detecting, but also what location those whales are calling from. So we can actually use them as direction finders and go and find the whales that are calling. Whales have unique identifying marks on them. And of course, Ted's going to tell you a bit more about that for humpback whales, who have distinct marks on their tails. They also have distinct marks on their flanks for blue whales and fin whales, for example. And for right whales, they've got big knobbly white callosities on their heads, which mean that we can identify them. So getting photo IDs is really important for being able to see how long they're resident in water. And if we see them in different years, the same animals or different animals, those photo IDs help us to match individuals to different areas of the South Atlantic. We also collect small skin samples. We bounce a biopsy dart off the skin of the whale and it collects a small amount of genetic material that we can also use a tiny bit of blubber for hormone and isotope analysis. Now that is looking at the skin chemistry of the whale in order to find out what it's been feeding on. We also collect overhead images of whales using drones. So we use drones for 2 things. Firstly, we've been able to get calibrated images of how fat the whales are to see how healthy they are. And we also collect with Petri dishes an exhalate sample, a whale blow, to find out how healthy the whale is by looking at its microbiome. We track whales using satellite tags. And that effectively means the whale is carrying the tag for a few months and then it drops off. And while the tag is on, it transmits regularly to a satellite and we find out where the whale's going and how it's using the habitat. And then finally, we use echo sounders, a form of active acoustics listening to the prey field in the water around the whales to find out what they're feeding on and what kinds of swarms of prey they feed on. So what do we find out about right whales? Actually, in 2019 and 2020, when we did those big surveys, we saw very few right whales. And these stars show the map. In green, you can see all the effort by the Braveheart survey in 2020. And there's just a few right whales sighted, and that's using acoustics as well as visuals to detect them. So we know there were hardly any right whales using those waters in 2020, with over 1,000 nautical miles of survey effort. In 2020, the acoustic sonar buoys, you can see those open circles, that's where the sonar buoys were deployed, and the filled circles in yellow show where they were detected just 3 times in 2020. However, in 2018, we got loads of detections. So these red circles show all the detections of right whales. So there were lots more right whales in 2018 and hardly any in 2020. Well, we're still trying to figure out what oceanographic conditions might have led to this. So what we know about southern right whales is that whilst they are regularly sighted off South Georgia, we know this from museum sightings. The Fishery Observer, the Faros vessel, has been sighting them for a few years, as well as our own project. We know that they're regularly sighted, but they really vary in their abundance between years, probably due to foraging conditions, which I'll touch on a little bit later in the talk. A really good story for humpbacks. So you can see this is the Braveheart survey again, and these orange squares show all the sightings of humpback whales around South Georgia. Absolutely loads of them. So that's roughly 734 individuals estimated in that survey, and nearly 50 photo IDs made of the undersides of the flukes. What was really interesting, going back to Cumberland Bay in 2019, this small powerboat survey I mentioned. So we went out any day that we had good weather, and we did surveys of the Cumberland Bay region and out to Stromness and St Andrews Bay. Now, these were areas, of course, the whalers were really active in the early whaling period, and I was curious to compare the amount of sightings we were making of humpbacks in the Cumberland Bay region, right out to the very entrance of the bay, and with what the conditions were like for catching whales in that very first season when Alison started the whaling station over at Grytviken. Now, in that first season, they had a single whale catcher, the Fortuna, and famously, they didn't really leave the bay the whole season. They didn't have to, because they were still getting set up and they could catch enough whales in the bay. So let's look at the numbers. Down here in this table, you can see the catches that were made in 1905 by month. And in January, there were 17 humpback whales caught. And in 2019, on our sightings effort, we were seeing 17 humpback whales in Cumberland Bay, right out to the mouth of the bay. So that's really similar levels of sightings to catches. Of course, this is not a quantitative comparison. The conditions for whalers were very, very different. Of course, there were different numbers of days. We were probably out on the water for different times with slightly different vessels, all of those things. But it was a positive sign that there are now whales in coastal waters around South Georgia that are similar to what they may have encountered in that first year. Now, the difference, of course, is that you can see blue and fin whales in these 1905 catches, and blue and fin whales are still rarely seen in the waters of Cumberland Bay. There was one blue whale seen last year, so there's still a way to go. But of course, humpbacks were whaled earlier and they're recovering sooner, and blue and fin whales might be coming back in due course, who knows. So humpback whale abundance was estimated from that big offshore survey done on the James Clark Ross, and Mick Baines led the analysis, and he and his team of 4, looking across the whole of South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands, estimated over 30,000 humpback whales now in both those areas. And in South Georgia alone, over 20,000 animals, which is a really healthy figure. This concords really nicely with a recent population assessment that was done of the whole Southwest Atlantic humpback whale population. Now, remember that I said that it's a Brazilian wintering ground that's connected to South Georgia. So if you look at this Brazilian population assessment, here you've got the population trajectory in blue, showing the numbers estimated before whaling, roughly 28,000, plummeting down with all the catches shown in red, nearly all from South Georgia, and then coming down to really low levels and then just starting to recover in the late 1990s. Now you can see these dots here. These are abundance estimates from the Brazilian wintering ground. Their estimate is that humpback whales are now 92% recovered off the Brazilian wintering ground. That's over 24,000 whales. And if you remember my estimate in the previous slide, we have really good concordance with what the Southwest Atlantic wintering ground abundance is looking like, and our estimate of abundance for the region, for the feeding area. So it suggests similar numbers of whales on the feeding ground to the breeding ground, and this higher number with South Sandwich Islands might also include whales recovering from Africa as well. An interesting pattern that we identified when we reviewed the museum sightings and reports of southern right whales and humpbacks was that there's a bit of a change going on now between those two species in terms of sightings. Now, if you look at this graph, you can see the total counts of whales that have been observed by people reporting to the museum at Grytviken since 1992. The dotted blue is southern right whales and the black line is humpback whales. There's also some dots here. These are the fishery observer vessels. They are also operating outside the main tourist season, so they give a nice complementary picture. You can see that numbers of right and humpback whales were really similar until after 2013, when they shot up for humpback whales, and they've just been going up ever since. So humpback whales suddenly increased in numbers after 2013. One of the things that might be happening is maybe there's more eyes on the water, increasing numbers of cruise ships. And whilst it is true that since 2010 there are more cruise ship visits, and you can see this graph showing an increase in cruise ship visits through time recently, the numbers of cruise ships that actually report sightings hasn't really changed. I think it's the usual people coming in and diligently informing the museum about what they've seen. So we think that actually there's steady numbers of reports, but it's a true phenomenon. There's suddenly a lot more humpback whales than there were before. We've been tracking humpback whales and southern right whales using satellite tracking at South Georgia. And there's Amy Kennedy, who led that work for us, and she's tagged 4 whales, 2 right whales and 2 humpback whales. You can see that the humpback whales use of South Georgia is mostly to the west in 2020, and we tagged 2 humpbacks in 2019, and they mostly use the east of South Georgia. Of course, it's different years, so we can't really draw much conclusion from the fact that they seem to use different areas. But one thing that was worth noting was that we found that both right whales and humpbacks, one of the 2 animals spent a lot of time in South Georgia waters through the autumn, and the right whale in particular stayed right until the winter before moving out into lower latitude grounds. This shows the importance of South Georgia right through multiple seasons for whales, and obviously we need to do more tracking to find out more about this. We're using this information now to figure out about habitat use and where the real hotspot areas are within these overall tracks that are important for them for feeding. So why are there contrasting patterns happening at South Georgia? Let's just look. We need to, in order to understand what's going on for these 2 species, we need to take a step back, because whales make enormous journeys. South Georgia is just a small part of a much bigger feeding ground realm for them. So right whales actually use multiple feeding areas. They are known as far south as the South Orkney Islands, occasionally seen in the peninsula. They also feed on the Patagonian shelf, and of course they're found at South Georgia. They're thought to feed both on krill and copepod crustaceans. So it's another type of crustacean, and those crustaceans, there are some species found at South Georgia that they might be feeding on, and also in the Patagonian shelf. Humpback whales, we think when they go south of 60, they are exclusively feeding on krill. And their recovery began in the South Sandwich Islands, because that's where they've been tracked to for the last couple of decades. However, as numbers increase, they seem to have been recolonizing South Georgia since about 2013. As right whales recover, it seems that they're now recolonizing other feeding areas, the Patagonian shelf and the southern Scotia Sea as well. So it remains to be seen how these patterns change, but clearly South Georgia is maintaining a steady number of right whales, whereas their numbers must be increasing elsewhere because their populations are steadily recovering on their calving grounds. Antarctic blue whales is my final little point for tonight. Now, they were critically endangered following whaling. This is a population trajectory showing them coming down from 240,000 animals down to nearly 0 from 1965 onwards. They're critically endangered, but the very good news is that they were really commonly sighted on the 2020 Braveheart survey. So what you can see here is blue circles showing where all the Antarctic blue whales were seen. That's 55 individuals in just over 3 weeks of survey, and 9 photo IDs of individuals. So it's a very good sign. Now, we can also detect Antarctic blue whales with sonobuoys, and a really useful thing with Antarctic blue whales is they have a very distinct call. So I'm just going to play that call for you now. Apologies, I've got a little bit of noise in the background. I'm just going to play that call for you now and hope you can hear it. It's called the Z call. I hope you could hear that okay. It's probably obvious why it's called the Z call. Of course, it's not actually something you could hear in reality, but it's been transposed so it could be heard by humans. There you go. So they have a distinctive call and we detected them. And sonar buoys that were deployed that told us the direction the whales were calling from showed the pattern of inshore presence of blue whales. Now you can see these little whiskers and these little whisker dots. The whiskers show the direction that the whale is calling from. So by looking at where those whiskers are, you can figure out where the whales are on the shelf. And you can see mostly they were on South Georgia Shelf and also at the shelf break. That work has also been reviewed by Susie Calderon, who's put together a lot of different sightings over the years and shown that there's clearly an increase in Antarctic blue whales sighted at South Georgia just in the last couple of years. So in summary, humpback whales and blue whales are returning to South Georgia. It's official. We've looked at the data and it's a really positive story. Clearly it's good feeding for them, and there's more we can do to find out about their habitat use, but we're really happy to be able to report that. Right, well, numbers are steady at South Georgia and we need to do more work to understand what they're feeding on, why they might vary in numbers between years, and how they use South Georgia waters. One of the innovative ways we can do that is by actually looking at their feces. So this is my student Danny Buss collecting some right whale feces out of the water, and we're analysing that right now to find out what species of prey they're actually eating. So thanks very much for your time. I just wanted to say a huge thanks to everyone who contributed their time and efforts to this, and the funders who supported us. A huge number of people did this work, and I'm very grateful to everybody for all this support to make this possible. Thanks a lot. Do follow our work at facebook.com/sgwhale.
Wonderful. Jennifer, thank you so much. That was riveting. I mean, just the scope and scale of what you do down there, and the kind of technical elements of that, it's just fascinating. We have lots of questions, I think, for you at the end, so brace yourself. Okay, now on to Ted Cheeseman. We're delighted to welcome Ted, great partner and collaborator of the UKAHT for over a long time. Really delighted he's here to talk to us a little bit about his work in whale conservation and also engaging in citizen science with whale conservation and identification. Ted, take it away.
Yes, thank you. Thanks all. Let's see if I can make the share screen here work and play my talk. All right, lovely. Well, mildly intimidating lineup to follow here, but there we go. Yeah, hopefully you learn something of it all. For me, much of what I have to bring here is framed by my own. So I first went to Antarctica in 1994, and most of my history there has been as a guide for my family's company, Cheeseman's Ecology Safaris. And it's really stunning to see what we are seeing now, because what I think we're in the midst of, what Jen is just speaking of, is really the world's greatest zoological recovery in the entire history of human experience on this planet. And sort of much of my experience of that is that, you know, up until such great efforts as the four voyages that Jen's put together, much of this has really gone on unobserved. So this is the only graph in my talk. But I put this forward just because it's so hard to grasp the scale of it. Jen said, as there were 2 million whales killed in the Southern Ocean, last century, there were 3 million whales killed worldwide in the industrial whaling era. And just for a little bit of framing, imagine that's essentially that's like the biomass of the entirety of humanity killed and turned into mostly margarine and fertilizer and dog food and such. And, you know, when you try to put numbers into it, it's just off the charts. I mean, so for example, in the late 20s, 1 year off of South Georgia, 171 fin whales just off of Cumberland Bay, and 102 blue whales a little ways outside. And what this is missing to me is is a frame of reference that really, puts the animal into the space. I mean, these were individuals, these are living creatures, and this is recent enough history that a lot of these individuals would still be alive today. So when I look at that history, and especially in the early years of going to South Georgia, I really wanted to frame it in this, like, how can we imagine what this place was pre-whaling, and what is the course of ecology, the human's role in it today? So a few scenes that I imagine many folks here on the talk are familiar with here: Salisbury Plain, king penguins, which of course these are marine creatures. We experience them on land, but this kind of abundance, this kind of density, of course the fur seals, this right whale bay in South Georgia, this kind of density, the fur seals were the first species to be removed from South Georgia. Elephant seals were removed almost entirely, somewhat reasonably managed by British authorities, but one species after next was largely removed from the island. And the oceans, especially in the 90s when I first went down there, this is a rare view of the Antarctic Ocean when on a blue sky, windless day, but an empty ocean where you could see any whale that blew for miles and miles and miles, and yet we really just were not seeing. We largely had left the oceans empty. And in the case, for example, of blue whales, 99.9% of individuals were removed, maybe 99.8%. down to just a few hundred animals from that, what Jen quoted, 240,000. And humpback whales down to under 2%. So really what we left, and what those of us who are going to Antarctica today are stepping into, was a very recent past of empty oceans. So I personally feel very fortunate of the timing of stepping into this. I mean, this is largely my experience, and now in the modern era, the experience of humans with whales is much more one of whale watching rather than hunting. And I've been very fortunate to facilitate this for decades. And it's a stunning thing to me. I know IATO doesn't terribly like us putting pictures of whales this close to zodiacs, but these whales came to us. And, having spent a century, humans having spent a century, all but removing the whales from the ocean, I find it rather amazing that they do turn around and come to us. And well, this isn't my photo, but that's my dad there, and the driving the Zodiac in the top left. Hi, Dad. And actually, these photos were taken in 2004, which for me was a really pivotal year because well, I'd been going to Antarctica. It was my 10th season down there, and so I had my stories, and I had my lectures, and I had my ways of trying to bring our guests, our travelers, into Antarctic science. But this was the first year I took a digital camera south. And so we suddenly had this incredible tool to be able to, see our photos in real time and turn them around and share them with our travelers. And I photographed this humpback whale just outside of Deception Island in the Bransfield Strait. And I was, well, what do we call it? Chimping when we're looking at our cameras. And I'm showing this to our guests. Hey, look, this whale survived the killer whale attack as a calf. So those rake marks, those scratches on the tips of its tail, are evidence of a killer whale attack. 2 different killer whales would have been holding on to this whale, trying to hold it down, but the whale got away and survived and grew to adulthood. So I was noticing this, and then just like 3 days later, I walk into Palmer Station, into the men's bathroom actually at Palmer Station, and lo and behold, on the wall is my whale. Right, there's a print of a photo of my whale here in the Gerlache Straits, and like I say, this was 2004. I had a bit of an epiphany with it, that actually there in the bathroom and onward from there kind of has been an element that has guided a lot of what I've done in the last 15 years since, which is Well, there were 2 points here in this. One is, I have much of my life has been about sharing these stories of the beauty of the Antarctic and how special it is and unique it is. And here was a story that I wanted to have more of, right? When this whale that we photographed in 2004, and some year before that was seen in the Gerlach Strait. I still don't to this day know who took this photo, though I have seen this whale elsewise. So a little bit of backstory here is the other side of this is that there's science in here, right? Here's 2 points of data, right? This whale is seen twice in 2 different locations on the Antarctic Peninsula, 2 different years, obviously returning to some extent to the same area. And this backstory, this is photo ID, this individually recognizable whales. Jen talked about it a bit with the photo IDs of blues and right whales and humpbacks. Every one of these animals is individually recognizable by natural markings on various parts of their bodies. And humpbacks are wonderfully generous with this. Usually when they dive, they will lift their tails. And when they do, they show off patterns. And in some cases, like this fine individual, very distinct and easy to tell apart. Some cases, not so much. So these black flukes where all you really have is little shapes on the trailing edges and maybe subtle scarring. So just at the same time as this, in the North Pacific, a big study was going on. It was called the SPLASH study. And this was just incredibly revealing. The SPLASH study basically took 18,000 different humpback whale encounters, photographs of the tails and genetic samples of many of them as well, matched them all together in just thousands of thousands of human hours, manually matching all these photos to find their population abundances and as well migratory patterns. So prior to this story, for example, I'm here in California, right on Monterey Bay. Prior to this, it was thought generally, it was assumed that the whales that were coming along the California coast and feeding here a little bit in Monterey Bay, we thought they were heading on up to Alaska, and actually that was their ultimate destination. Lo and behold, we learned that this is, coastal California was their destination. But this is a kind of richness of data that we just didn't have in the Antarctic. We didn't know this level of detail. So a long story short, more or less, we decided, hey, let's build a tool and see if we can basically crowdsource and pull together enough information to get this kind of learning and as well make it really accessible. So we built a website and called it Happy Whale. And the goal has always been to make it easy, but also make it rewarding. So, if we ask people to do something hard, at least it's more rewarding than it is difficult. But mostly make it easy. Set your camera to the right time and date, shoot pictures, submit them to Happy Whale. And for us, the arc of the success of this really has been building off of, well, first and foremost, building from existing research. So for the Antarctic, we worked with the Antarctic Humpback Whale Catalog at Allied Whale and College of the Atlantic and had a large set of known whales, North Pacific, North Atlantic as well, with a couple different research institutions, which meant we really had something to build on. And then outreach to the community. And here, IATO, International Association of Antarctic Tour Operators, which is hugely helpful, getting the word out across all ships. And so here's a map of all the contributions of one expedition staff, actually an early adopter, Mike Greenfelder, who sort of saw this as something really cool, a chance to contribute to science. And here's all the whales around the world that he has contributed. Fast forward a little ways, and what we've been able to do is link those sightings to other sightings of whales. And so what you have is Mike's photos of his whales and all the photos of Mike's whales that we've gathered from research collaborators and the public as well. So to the public end of it, it's a rewarding experience. Hey, we've seen your whale. Awesome, thank you for your photos. Yes, your whale's new to science, if we're able to determine that. Or, hey, your whale's been identified. A critical part of this has been automated image recognition, actually automating getting the computer to recognize those flukes. And then further along, as we gained momentum, really critical here was actually partnering with further research effort, Jen Jackson's project in South Georgia, not least of all, and Southern Ocean Research Partnership, IWC, in collaboration with the Australian Antarctic Program, put together this PDF guide, saying, hey, what is a good photograph, and getting the word out there. And this is kind of the end of that arc where we've gotten more and more research collaborators aboard so that we can, one, make best use of the data, but also bring together research data sets. And that's been really huge and actually adding up, such that in some areas we now know most of the whales in the ocean. So for the Antarctic, here's the collected set of our most traveled part of Antarctica. And most of these arrows, these are migratory connections for humpback whales, mostly humpback whales. One of these, though, the arrow from the Antarctic Peninsula to South Georgia, that is the one right whale that has been resighted between Antarctica and South Georgia. And the Antarctic image came from an expedition guide, and the South Georgia image came from Jen's project there. So it's been really neat. I mean, it's not just a data collection process for me. It's been really neat to see this data getting pushed into the sciences. We have a few little publications. Actually, this one just came out a couple weeks ago, which I think is actually ecologically pretty interesting and significant. I think many folks here who have expeditioned in the Antarctic, maybe you've seen a few humpbacks along in the Chilean fjords. Those whales, there's just about 200, really tight population estimate, 200, 250 individuals there, I think it is. Well, they're almost exclusively feeding in Chile, but a few individuals, we found 2 matches, and then also looking at stable isotopes in blubber, have found evidence of krill foraging, Antarctic krill foraging, in a couple other humpbacks. So we know that these populations are connected, just rather minimally so. Stepping back globally, a lot of our work my work has been focused on the areas that I have most personal experience in, the North Pacific and the Antarctic Peninsula. But the effort has really been quite global, and here you can see migratory patterns for humpbacks around the world. So as Jen was saying, these whales largely, they're feeding in high latitude areas with colder waters, more productive waters. Most of the great whales follow some kind of pattern along these lines, although the patterns vary quite a bit by species and by population. With humpbacks, the Antarctic humpbacks that we see, West Antarctic Peninsula, they're mostly migrating up to the west coast of South America, but there's a little bit of connectivity to the Western Pacific. And the extent of that and the significance of that, that's something that really hasn't been well defined. And we're building this data set together in order, in part, to see, that Central and Western Pacific population is one of the populations that we don't see rapidly recovering like many of the other populations of humpbacks have done since whaling. So why is that? Don't really know. But out of this, we've had some pretty fun little findings. For example, one whale that the west and east coast of South America breeding populations are almost totally separate. But we found a couple cases of individuals traveling between the two, and published a little paper on that, where one of the migratory reroutings was an individual that seemed to maybe move around an El Nino year. As well, we found a whale that migrated all the way from the Antarctic Peninsula up to Nicaragua, which happens to be the furthest north migration of any mammal seen from Antarctica, unless you count, those of us who consider ourselves Antarcticans, maybe we migrate a bit further, but at least as far as a whale is concerned, all the way up into Nicaragua. And then this one I'm quite excited about. We found a whale that went all the way from the Antarctic Peninsula to east coast of Australia, and there's a little publication coming out here soon. So like I say, though, the real success, I think, comes, well, one step in the maturing of this comes when we can integrate research data with these massive public data sets. I mean, the great thing about our ships, the IATO ships, Arctic traveling ships, and so on, and whale watch operations, coastal whale watch operations, is that we're present constantly, year after year after year, day after day. Of course, not this year so much, COVID being what it is, that we've literally have had one humpback whale photo from the Antarctic Peninsula, and it was from a dead calf. A little bit of a sad situation, but we have this constant presence, which I see as very complementary to the kind of in-depth voyage that Jen has been able to put together. And, you know, she moved absolute mountains to do that. And that's not something that's going to happen every year, much less. I mean, what was it? There were something like 370 departures for Antarctic in the last full year of voyages. So what I'm looking forward to doing, for example, the IWC has a data set of Southern Ocean surveys, which as yet we haven't integrated this in, but I'm really hoping, for example, you see this data set out in the Amundsen Sea. There's one little sighting. We literally have one humpback whale photo from the middle of the Amundsen, or actually that's far enough west, I think it may be into or west of the Bellinghausen Sea into the Amundsen Sea. And that one photo we were able to match, it was from an ocean-wide expedition, able to match it up to a whale in Panama. So nobody really knows how much do these Central American and South American whales, how much do they use that open ocean as compared to the Antarctic Peninsula? Well, maybe this data set can give us a little bit of a hint of that. But for me, you know, this is not just a data hoarding exercise. I think it's really wonderful to put together a robust picture of how many whales are here. But really, ultimately, I think the success here is when we can push this data into conservation science. And I think what's actually been a huge and you know, source of optimism for me is the responsiveness of the Antarctic tourism community in particular to you know, a desire to be involved in science and to actually integrate that science into operations. So as of January of 2020, obviously not anticipating the total COVID shutdown, but this 2,000 square kilometer region, the most heavily traveled and possibly the most whale rich region of the Antarctic Peninsula, we all Antarctic tour operators agreed unanimously to maintain a maximum speed of 10 knots. And one big part of that, I believe, is because from a ship operator point of view, it's a whole lot nicer to have your passengers out photographing a whale and hearing, yay, your whale's new to science. That's a whole lot better of an experience than having your passengers photographing a dead whale on the bow of your ship. And this is actually, unfortunately, quite a reality up in Alaska. We were able to, just earlier this year, actually match, and this is the product of our automated image recognition, and a decomposed fluke of a whale that had been killed by a ship. We're able to identify the individual to determine, you know, this was a whale. It was not a juvenile. Most of the ship strikes we see tend to be juveniles, but in this case, it was a full adult whale that was at least 25 years old. So on the Antarctic Peninsula, there's, you know, like I say, this is very much complementary to more quote unquote traditional science programs. We have this concentration of data. If you look down in the Gerlache Straits here in the southern part of the map, there's this high concentration of data. Why? You know, there compared to Elephant Island up in the top right of the map? Well, it's probably not because there's more whales in the Gerlache Straits than there is around Elephant Island. It's because it's a whole lot easier to get out and photograph. So for me, the you know, big part of this are the next steps. What can we do from here? all of this pretty much is kind of presence only data, as in when it's convenient, get outside and take pictures of the whales and share them with us. But there's a couple programs afoot, like for example, Hurtigruten has this really neat program where they're hosting observers, marine mammal observers aboard their ships doing distance sampling. And we're trying to build that into a set of technologies where it's really easy for this to be integrated across many more ships so that we can get good, what's called distance surveying, so that we can get presence and absence data, for example, actual survey efforts aboard. One of the exciting next steps to me is automated image recognition for other species and projects involving other species. Happy Whale is hosting at this point a leopard seal project. There's no automated image recognition, it's all manual matching. But these marks along the face of the leopard seal, these are individually recognizable. So we have a couple cases of leopard seals resighted over a number of years, and you know, only in the last few months gave a call out and asked folks, hey, contribute your leopard seal photos. Hopefully one aspect of this is building a data set that's large enough that we can then automate the image recognition and make this able to scale much more broadly. So it's a really wonderful way to be able to contribute to science. And I guess if I could wrap up here, it would be with a call to action to say, you know, for those involved in the Antarctic and polar guiding and whale watching and various, you know, interface of nature industries, you know, there is, I'm involved in the Polar Citizen Science Collective, which is an effort to really get the public involved in science here on these vessels. And the call to action really is, okay, it's just not that hard to get people into science because, you know, everyone thinks about going to Antarctica and they say, oh, I want to take a picture of, you know, I want my picture taken with a penguin. But, and by the statistics, maybe only 2% of participants do science while aboard, but the experience of doing science is something that stays with them forever. And the thing that I'm delighted to be able to speak of is that this science is having a real solid impact and being very, very well received by the research community as a wonderful complement, given the data scarcity of the regions that we're traveling. So there we go. That's my talk, and thank you so much.
Fantastic. Ted, thank you so much. Fascinating and great to see this amazing collaboration between visitors and scientists and the tourism industry. I think fantastic work going on there. Okay, it's Q&A time. We have a whole bunch of interesting questions for you all. I've tried my best to kind of clump them a little, so I'm trying to theme the questions a little bit for the panel so you can get an opportunity to answer them. So I'm going to kick off with going back to Bjørn and your talk about the whaling industry and the history of whaling. One of the first questions was, what was the impetus for the Norwegians catching whales in the Southern Ocean? The anonymous caller says, I remember eating whale meat in Norway in the 1970s, tasting rather like fishy school liver. Bjørn, could you comment on that?
He's muted.
Excuse me, you were quite unstable now. Could you repeat that question? I'm so sorry.
Of course, yes. So what was the impetus for the Norwegians catching whales in the Southern Ocean? Why were they whaling?
Well, as for any other nation, I guess it was a commercial enterprise with profits, and so it's not more difficult than that, I guess, to explain why the Norwegians were doing this. They had a history that went further back than Antarctica, of course, but and it was to some extent pushed forward by prohibitions for whaling along the Norwegian coast and a lack of whales elsewhere. But well, it was a hunt for profit, I guess, as in any other industry.
Great, thank you. Whether
as simple as that.
Yes, indeed. Yes, thanks, Bjørn. And were there any protections afforded to whales at that time during the early 20th century?
No, not really. There had been protection regimes in other areas, but for Antarctica, well, there were, like within the Falkland Island dependencies in South Georgia, there were quotas and there were licenses, and there were restrictions on the number of, not on the the number of whales you were allowed to kill, but on the equipment and on the number of companies that were allowed to be used. So that was an aspect of regulation in the early 20th centuries. Then from the 1930s, there were some quota agreements between companies, and then eventually, of course, more and more regulations came when the International Whaling Commission was established after World War II. So it was an increase in regulation continuously, I would say. But everything too late, too little.
Indeed, thank you. Okay, just looking at surveying whales now. Was there any information collected on the southern minky whale during the surveys? So this is a question for Jennifer.
Well, actually, we hopefully you can hear me okay. We were collecting information on all the whales that we saw in terms of observations, and we only saw 1 or 2 minky whales each year, so it wasn't really much to report. The main distribution for Antarctic minky whales would be further south, so we wouldn't necessarily expect many of them, but I think they're periodically seen around South Georgia, so I'm sure we'll continue to see 1 or 2, and maybe more in future.
Yeah, and similar question. Sylvia asks, she's visited South Georgia several times, but in the 30 years of visiting South Georgia, very rarely seen orcas or killer whales. Could you explain why that might be?
Yeah, that's an interesting thing. I mean, I think because there weren't many whales until recently, there weren't many killer whales, because they're, you know, of course, with the fur seals recovering, that would be the big thing, I think, bringing killer whales in. But they're a top predator, so there's always going to be very few of them using an area. And I think we're going to be seeing more killer whales as we've got increasing amounts of krill predators in those waters. But I think they've just been a little bit slow to follow up and probably sort of just track the recovery of those other species. But I don't have a really good reason for that. I don't know if the other panelists have a better idea.
Anybody want to follow up on that one?
Well, I think it's just what Jen said. It's, as a top predator, you don't see them that much. And quite frankly, the experience of the visitor in South Georgia is fairly land focused, right? So we don't spend a lot of time, unlike the Antarctic Peninsula, where you're cruising in the Gerlach Straits, and you do have I think a broad view of a large ocean area where killer whales are seen with some frequency, and there's quite a density of them there. But why not? I mean, so there's definitely quite a lot of killer whales in the larger South Georgia environment. As anyone involved with the South Georgia toothfish fishery knows, right? They have the habit of depredating lines there, but that's offshore, right? So killer whales, yeah, I mean, probably there's some tracking of the history of the removal of these large marine mammals, which would have been the killer whale's prey. Maybe we'll start seeing them more, but they are there. There's no question that they're there. It's just not, they're not super visible, for one.
Thank you. Okay, just moving on to a few technical questions. So a couple of people have asked about the use of acoustics in surveying for whales. Is there any work done on the impact of acoustics on humpback whales and southern right whales? And does it disturb marine life at all?
So the work we're doing is passive acoustics, which means it's listening. It's not releasing sound, it's listening. So when we're trying to locate whales, what we're doing is not making specific noises. That said, as I mentioned, we also use an echo sounder to survey the prey field around whales. They're at the level at which we're doing it, then no. Of course, there is evidence that larger acoustic seismic surveys, for example, those kinds of surveys definitely can impact on whale behavior. So it's certainly an important thing to bear in mind when doing studies that use acoustics. But at the level that we were doing it, that wasn't an issue for disturbance of our whales.
Thank you. How do you tag whales to track them? Somebody has asked.
Yeah, so you have to, effectively what we use, there are different ways to tag whales. You can use a suction cup, which gets 2 or 3 days of really highly detailed information about their precise behavior. But if you want to get longer term information that gives you maybe a few months, then you need to use an implantable tag. And implantable tags basically deployed at close range into the outer blubber layer of the whale, and then they remain in there attached, and they come out and fall off after a few months. So those are the kinds of tags we were using at South Georgia.
Thank you very much. Okay, a question about the hydrophone data that you collect. How do you manage and store it? There must be an awful lot of it. And is it available for access, public access?
So we've only done, so you mean the Sonobuoys, or we had one hydrophone array, but the Sonobuoy data is available. So we everything that we publish is archived at the British Antarctic Survey through the Polar Data Centre. So I think that that acoustic data should be available on request in about a year or so. But please, you can contact me directly if you're interested in the data and want to ask about that in more detail.
Fantastic, thank you. Okay, this is a question probably for both Jen and Ted. Is there much use of data science and machine learning? So Ted talked about visual recognition, but machine learning and processing the various types of data and observations in the work that you both do. Does it help predict patterns, and have predictions been accurate?
It's a good question for Ted, I think.
You would. Okay, so my experience of machine learning has been of automated image recognition. Definitely artificial intelligence has just changed what we've been able to do. I mean, I essentially have, I wouldn't say single-handedly, but I've been the center point for aggregating image catalogs from around the world, where we have over 50,000 different individual humpback whales together. And I'm able to do that because machine learning for visual recognition of whales has reduced our matching time to like well under 1% what it used to be. It used to be for a large catalog, it'd take maybe an hour to match an individual fluke to confirm, either yes, we found a match might be quick, but if you don't find a match, confirming that it's a new whale take more than an hour. So I'm able to do that now in seconds. That this is not predicting patterns of, sort of what are the results in the data. Acoustics has used machine learning a lot, which fits really nicely for acoustics because it's mathematical first off, right? The math of sound is fairly easily translated into something recognizable to a computer, but it's a front that is the inflection point is now, and it's moving so quickly that I had a computer vision fellow mention to me the other day that the way that we're doing automated image recognition of whale tails is quote unquote old school. The algorithm is 2 years old, right? So yeah, there's so much potential in there, and it's quite disruptive. And the interesting part about these marine sciences is we do tend to be, because of just funding, we do tend to be product takers, as in like, okay, it's been applied in some other realm, like medical realm, where there's a lot more money going into it, and then we figure out a way to kind of reposition it and repurpose it into marine sciences. What I really love are the occasional times when we're using the really cutting edge bit of it, like our algorithm was when it first came out, even though now it's a bit old school. But yeah, there's a lot.
Fantastic. Okay, lots of talk about using photo ID, obviously the work you do, Ted, particularly, but how do you identify individuals without photo ID? So I think something that you alluded to, Jennifer, in your talk. Can you be certain that you're not double counting by counting individuals twice, thinking they're different?
Is that a question? Oh, sorry, that
was a question for you, Jen. So how do you identify large numbers of individuals without photo ID?
Oh, I see. Thank you. So that, I think, refers to our estimates of abundance. Well, that's a different approach to the approach where there are multiple ways to estimate the abundance of animals. One way to do that is to use, for example, mark recapture methods. And with mark recapture, you're looking at marked animals. So you're looking at photo ID'd animals, and you see how many times you see them over time. You can use that to measure abundance. But another way to do that is literally just by visual observation on a structured survey that has a defined probability of sighting animals across the area. You've created you've created a way of surveying the area so that you've got a good probability of coverage, and then you count the animals that you see, and then you use that information to extrapolate to a broader area and measure abundance. So that's the approach that we took for example, the 2009 work that I mentioned, that was the krill synoptic survey, and that was based on counts of animals, not photo ID.
Brilliant, lovely, thank you. So a little bit about blue whales. There's a lot of interest in the blue whales this evening. So one question is, are the blue whales in South Georgia the same population that can be seen off the coast of Sri Lanka?
No, it's not actually. So blue whales have quite a complicated population structure. The critically endangered blue whales that we're really interested in at South Georgia are Antarctic blue whales. That's a subspecies of blue whale, and it's the largest of the blue whale population. So that's the largest species on the planet. There are other blue whales around the Southern Hemisphere that are distinct populations, but they're smaller than the Antarctic blue whale. And the way that we know they're distinct is they've got different calls. So the population of blue whales off Sri Lanka has a different call from the Antarctic blue whale, and it is a distinct population.
Brilliant, thank you. Someone's also said blue whales are seen in certain different places. What is it that drives them to certain places? Is it food, or is it conditions? What is it that makes them cluster at certain places?
Well, in the Southern Ocean, whales obviously are looking for food, and they're looking for large amounts of food. They are extremely large animals, and that means it takes energy just to open a mouth of that size and to lunge for food. So they need to feed on really large, dense krill swarms, and that's where they're going to go. And so if you're finding a lot of blue whales, you're finding a really productive area, because they're not going to bother with small, patchy krill swarms. They need highly dense, productive regions in order to feed. So big krill swarms in high densities.
And does that also account for their migration between oceans, in areas of the ocean as well?
I'm not sure what you mean specifically.
Whereas people are saying, what's the explanation for their migration, particularly around South America, or perhaps do they migrate between the Pacific and the Atlantic, perhaps?
Blue whales.
Any whales, I think was the question. Is there any explanation for why whales migrate to the west of South America rather than into the Atlantic? And there was another similar question about what makes them, what drives them to migrate around between oceans.
Well, they tend to, I think there's two things at play there. So whales make enormous migrations. They've got a large body size. They can travel longer distances with lower energy in the sea than a similar, something on the land that's very large is going to expend a lot of energy. There's less energy required, so they can make longer distance journeys than terrestrial mammals. There's that. They will make very long journeys. Some of the record-breaking journeys will be the ones, as Ted was mentioning, he's finding some absolutely record-breaking migrations between breeding areas and feeding areas for humpback whales, because it's a fairly low energy activity for them to migrate relative to some other animals. They can make these huge journeys, and they will be going to the places where they can get enough food to make it worthwhile to go back to those low latitude, low productive zones for extended periods. So they're really quite tied to areas of lots of food because they need to stock up for these long migrations and that long period of time apart. But the thing with humpback whales, I think the more we look, the more we find that they do move sometimes between oceans, and it's possible that they'll migrate south, and then they might join another group of humpbacks going back to another breeding ground. For the most part, these whales seem to have fidelity to certain areas, but we are clearly seeing a lot of movements as well.
Great, thank you. Okay, a little bit about species interaction. Do separate whale species interact with one another, and do they tolerate each other or avoid each other? And similar related question, is there competition between whales and seals for food?
So you sometimes see whales feeding together. If they're feeding, you've got a lot of krill, there's a big krill swarm, you might see multiple whale species feeding in the same area. It's really hard to know much more than that about their interaction, and certainly I'm afraid I'm not a behavioral expert to comment on that much more. But in terms of competition, that's a bit of a difficult one as well, because what we've learned about whales, mostly from work that Ari Friedlander and other teams working in the Antarctic Peninsula, Luciano Della Rosa and those guys, they've been looking at behavior, and it seems that the whales partition habitat to an extent. What I mean by that is they might prefer different krill swarm sizes, feeding at different depths. And so they've got slight differences in, what's their optimum for feeding. And so when you see them, in the same krill swarm, we don't always really understand that they might be feeding at different depths or preferring, different sizes of krill more broadly. So we have a lot to learn to figure out whether there's actually competition in play. At the moment, I think it's too early to say, because of the different ways that they target different aspects of krill.
Great, thank you. So just thinking about the recovery, what was the impact and the implications of the recovery on food stocks? So is there enormous pressure on the krill population? And are there risks from rapid recovery in terms of, is there going to be sufficient food?
That's a really good question, and I think everybody wants to know that. I mean, one of the things that's really important to us, certainly delivering this information, because the government of South Georgia really wants to do the best job of making sustainable decisions, because there is a krill fishery there. And at the moment, it seems that whales are doing very well, and they're recovering as fast as they could following whaling, which suggests that they're not limited for resources. But in terms of I'm sorry, I just had to take a step back because I actually just forgot your question halfway through, Camilla.
That's fine. So what's the impact of recovery on populations of other species, particularly krill, of course, which are their primary food source? Does the rapid recovery have increased the pressure on the food source?
It may do, but there may also be a rewilding effect. We don't really understand this very well, but I'm fascinated by the terrestrial examples of rewilding that are happening now as we learn more about how some animals coming back can influence some others in a positive way. Whales coming back into an ecosystem might also mean more primary productivity because they're defecating, they're churning up layers, and it may be that that's also improving primary productivity in areas where they're recovering too. So it's not necessarily going to be a straightforward case that whales are going to deplete krill. Again, I think it's just something we need to watch. I think, to be honest, it's arguably going to be about environmental variation due to more extreme weather events that they're going to have problems with, particularly at South Georgia. Because as I mentioned, South Georgia sends tons of krill in on the major Antarctic circumpolar current. But in bad krill years on the peninsula, then that's almost, that's amplified at South Georgia. So you get much less krill than you would say at the peninsula, even in a bad krill year. So you get these really extreme boom and bust scenarios. And then that's going to be a bigger effect, I think, the environmental variation potentially influencing availability of food, especially when whale populations have recovered. We'll probably see that because of increased deaths of calves on feeding ground, on breeding grounds, and more strandings of whales in poor food years.
I might jump in. There's one thing.
Sure.
So there's sort of two parts of that. One is, the hypothesis was when you removed all the whales, you'd have this quote unquote krill surplus, right? You'd have this vast unutilized resource, but whether that's true or not, I mean, it's exactly what Jen's saying is, do the whales actually create the conditions in which more krill ultimately thrive, much as we've seen in Yellowstone? As the wolves have come back, they've created an environment that's much healthier for the species that they prey upon. Different, obviously very different circumstance. But the other thing to think about is, so in the recovery, I mean, this is a very, very fast recovery that we're seeing. And for me doing this photo ID, it's a really surprising piece where from South Georgia, we are not finding as many matches to Brazil as we should when I look at just pure numbers. And I think there's two possible explanations there. One, and it's probably a bit of both. One is unsampled breeding areas, whales coming to South Georgia, maybe from places other than Brazil. But the other thing is, this is such a young population. It's recovering such that so many individuals are so young that they haven't had time to sort of be sampled in Brazil, being photographed in Brazil. And that element, we have a population that's returning to, the populations of these whales lost a lot of knowledge of where and how to feed. And so they're essentially rediscovering these waters. And while they're rediscovering them, these waters are changing faster really than in any time in recent history because of climate change. And if you look, actually, the Australian Antarctic program did a really neat multimedia feature on their krill survey voyages. It's online. I don't know if you Google, krill survey Australian Antarctic program, probably find it. But in it, right at the end of it, there's a graphic that shows the state of oceans in terms of the ability of krill eggs to develop, given the acidity that that climate change is bringing on. And over the next 100 years and beyond, we're making these oceans potentially far less. That literally the oceans just can't produce the kind of krill because they become too acidic. Which it's scary to think. Now we're the best way to conserve a population is to stop killing it, and we've done that for the whales. But the next thing is that they need oceans that are healthy enough for them to live in, and that's the state we're in today. Is how are we changing that environment?
Thank you. I suppose a related question then. A lot of questions about krill fishing, of course, something that's growing, obviously. So, what could you maybe both of you comment on the impact of krill fishing on whale populations, and how this might roll out in the future, and in terms of the whale recovery?
So I think it's hard to tell at the moment. Krill fishing, of course, it's managed in a way that's taking into account, as far as possible, other animals in the ecosystem. And one of the things I understand, so Camilla, the body that oversee management of krill, are reviewing, I believe they're doing a krill risk assessment right now, which takes into account the abundance of whales as well as the abundance of other krill predators. That's a really, really good thing, because of course it's taking this new recovery, these large numbers of whales now, into account in krill quota setting. Do I think it's going to impact whales? I think that one of the challenges is, when you're looking at krill quotas and things like that, is managing for all the different animals and how they behave in the ecosystem. And whales are less area restricted than other krill predators. So for example, in the summer, if you're a penguin or a seal and you've got young, you're staying really close to the shore, and so you kind of need to be able to feed around there. Whereas whales don't have that problem. They can move over broader areas. So I think that in general, the impact of the fishery is going to be more will be more important to manage in relation to local populations of krill predators. But for whales, I think, because they have more flexibility, I think that they'll be able to cope better.
There's an aspect of krill fishing, actually, it's just exactly what Bjørn said with regards to whale hunting management: too little, too late, right? So when you look at the history of whale science, it was piggybacked onto whaling and did not upset the boat, right? And so whales were hunted until they were commercially extinct. And while we look at, the legislation in the 70s and 80s that saved the whales, protected the whales, really that was after the fact, once the whales were gone. If we do the same thing for krill, we will be doing ourselves a really, really massive disservice. And thus far, the krill industry seems very keen on integrating the best science. And I think that it is a responsibility of, like, Camilla and the world's governments and really of society to say it is important that we manage this, proactively and precautionarily, so that, right now krill fisheries are tiny, but when you have a resource that large and a species as hungry as humans are, that may not, remain the case. And so it's up to us really to be very vigilant in it, and not just say, oh, krill fishery is bad, but it's, how do we manage the krill fishery, and how do we learn from the mistakes of very recent history?
Thank you. And Bjørn, is there any historical perspective you'd like to add to that at all?
You want to comment on the krill?
Yeah, well, reflect.
Well, It is maybe not reassuring that there are quite a few Norwegian companies that are active in krill fisheries these days, and the Norwegians don't have a very good record, obviously, in catching any species historically in the Antarctic. But as far as I know, these companies, they seem to be extremely concerned about quotas and careful management, and you mentioned Camilla and the management systems there. So, well, my view is that it seemed to be that the krill fishery, at least, seemed to be very much better managed than the whaling ever was. That's for sure.
Thank you. Okay, the recovery of whale populations that you're observing in South Georgia is a very intensively studied area. A few questions around, people have asked, is this indicative of recovery in wider areas, so further in the Southern Ocean or further around the world? Could you extrapolate from there, or is it?
It is local. I mean, I think we have to see this at the level of the South Atlantic, and that's because whale populations are structured. You know, I'm going to take humpbacks and southern right whales first. We know that they have regional population structure, and by that what I mean is that we know that they have calving or wintering grounds in lower latitudes, they're defined areas, and we know that they're not moving, you know, all over the whole southern hemisphere. They're particularly returning to those specific sites, and we know that because there are genetic differences between populations showing that they're somewhat distinct. That's important when we think about whale recovery for conservation, because you need to understand at what level the population, you know, is operating. Is it the whole of the Southwest Atlantic, or, you know, is it the whole of the South Atlantic? And when you get the level right, you can then do the assessment, such as that population trajectory by Alex Beanie that I showed you, showing 93% recovery. Now, humpback whales and southern right whales have this regional population structure. So we know that what this is showing is, for example, that humpback whales are looking really healthy in the South Atlantic. Blue whales, Antarctic blue whales in particular, they have a much broader summer distribution around the Southern Ocean. And so far, there isn't strong evidence of regional population structuring of blue whales and Antarctic blue whales into different oceans. That may be due to a lack of data, because all of our information comes from the feeding area, where it may be that there's a mixture of populations. So there's clearly more work to be done to understand that. And that means that a recovery at South Georgia may be indicative of a broader recovery in the Southern Ocean. But certainly there's more work needing to be done. And actually, the International Whaling Commission is conducting a new population assessment of the recovery of Antarctic blue whales in the next year or two. So we should be getting some more news, both on the population structuring and the recovery in the next year.
Ted, anything you'd like to add to that, looking at what you've seen?
Well, so yes, I mean, I think it is very local, and yet there are trends, and I think it's really cool to see again and again and again local humpback whale populations in particular reestablishing, rediscovering, and I think actually that phrasing that suggests an element of culture is quite appropriate. And culture in whale science and animal science is having a bit of a heyday right now, and I think it's you know, could be overstated, but mostly it's important to recognize that these whales, they have site fidelity, not just from blind genetics or what, but probably from knowledge, at least passed from mother to calf. And, you know, the fact that Jen saw some parallel in numbers of whale sightings in Cumberland Bay compared to what Larson saw that's just the coolest, because one of the things Larson said was you could walk across the backs of the whales to shore. Now that may or may not have been a fish story, right? But until these recent years, we never saw these kinds of numbers in South Georgia immediate waters, right? And in the 90s, we didn't see those kinds of numbers along the Antarctic Peninsula, two different populations. Again and again, just on my California coast here, we didn't see humpback whales in these numbers until the 2000s. The Salish Sea in between Washington and British Columbia has had essentially a recolonization of humpback whales in the last, and these are actually each one of these different populations that probably overlap, you know, there's interchange some, but not a lot. And this story has repeated many times, yet to generalize and say, oh, well, the whales are saved would be, I think, pretty foolhardy, because you do have some species, actually the North Atlantic right whale, that has, you know, 300 some odd individuals. Every individual pretty much is known. The species has never recovered from whaling. And unfortunately for the northern right whale, when whaling stopped, shipping, entanglement in crab fishing or in lobster fishing gear and other fishing gear, and now climate change pushing them around out of their normal feeding areas, these things are combining to keep the species from recovery. So generalizing on the grossest scale, yes, most great whale populations are recovering, but on the individual scale, there's some real conservation questions in there, and yeah, it's kind of a critical state for many species in the ocean today.
Oh, thank you. With a population recovery from such low numbers observed, what are the implications of this for a genetic bottleneck?
That is an interesting question, and it makes well, it actually relates. We've been doing some work looking at, you know, the level of diversity of these populations in South Georgia. The fact is that the genetic bottleneck, I mean, a genetic depletion happens when you've had a long exploitation bottleneck. And for the southern right whales, which have been exploited for 350 years in the South Atlantic, that's a long bottleneck relative to the generation time of a southern right whale, which would be a few decades. So that means that they've really lost genetic diversity over that time because they've been at small numbers for a long time. But when it comes to things like humpback whales and blue whales, they were exploited just in the 20th century. And that really intense period of exploitation where their bottleneck was actually quite brief relative to the length of their generation time. So if that makes sense, you have maybe 20, 30 year bottleneck, and actually the generation time of an animal is about 20, 30 years. The reason that's related is if you've got multiple generations in the bottleneck period, you're losing diversity rapidly. What we see for blue whales and humpback whales is not that much of a loss of diversity. There might be a bit of a lag and there'll be more diversity lost over time, but because it was quite a brief bottleneck, they've lost less diversity than southern right whales, for example.
That's fascinating, thank you. And I suppose what might be the impact as well of recovery of particular species of whales on other species, or is there an observation effect there in terms of which species are being studied?
I don't think we have enough data to know if there's any impact of the recovery of one on another. I mean, the obvious and interesting pattern that we've noticed is that there's a lot more humpback whales around in South Georgia than there were before, and we don't know if that might impact the right whales. My theory is no. Right whales feed in a different way from humpback whales. They require either really large krill swarms or they'll feed on copepods, like dense krill swarms, because they don't feed by lunging. Whereas humpback whales are more flexible. They can feed on smaller krill swarms, and they can feed on more varieties of krill swarms. So I think that I can't really see any evidence of impacts on each other at the moment in my populations.
Thank you. And just thinking about the other risks, and sort of bringing it a little bit up to date, can you comment on any impact there may have been of the intrusion of ginormous icebergs at South Georgia? I'm thinking particularly of A68, of course. Anything to comment on there in terms of the impact on whales?
Well, the big thing is that, so when I explained about that movement of krill from the peninsula, there is something, I saw a question in the Q&A which I can answer at the same time. So actually the current that comes from the peninsula, following the front, it actually winds around the northeast of South Georgia first, and it kind of goes counterintuitively. It doesn't hit South Georgia and go west to east along the north coast. It goes east to west, because just of the direction of the front. Now, the iceberg was taking the same trajectory. Now, the iceberg was coming from the peninsula, and what it may have done is blocked really large krill swarms that were also traveling in the same direction. It may have reduced the amount of krill getting to South Georgia this season. And that will be reflected more in, I think, what's going to happen in the smaller krill predators, the penguins and the seals using the local waters in the summer. So far, the team who are doing science at King Edward Point this season, the British Antarctic Survey team, they've hardly seen any whales. So it's quite possible that there's less krill as a consequence of the iceberg, but it remains to be seen. We need to see what the krill surveys look like as well.
Great, thank you. Okay, thinking about citizen science a little bit, a couple of people asked, when's the best time to see whales around South Georgia and the Antarctic Peninsula? Ted, that might be one for you.
Yeah, so South Georgia, it varies a bit by species, but certainly, actually both the peninsula and South Georgia is a bit later in the year, from January on. As much as whales have returned, it still remains that most voyages tend to be land focused. So the opportunities for seeing whales around South Georgia tends to be a bit limited. It's the exception is oftentimes when vessels are rounding Cooper Island down in the south. Those are just fantastically rich waters that, and then also while the ships are traveling past Shag Rocks, that's an area where we have seen in recent years some what you might call super aggregations of feeding whales. The open waters from South Georgia to the peninsula can be great for fin whales. I have yet to myself ever see an Antarctic blue whale. I will be really, really excited when someday I do. And then once you get down onto the Antarctic Peninsula, you know, mid to later season. So like my company, Cheeseman's Ecology Safaris, we do relatively whale-focused voyages starting, you know, I like to go in, well, from January on, you are likely to see large numbers of whales, February and March, and the whale season may extend on out. I mean, there's very little observational effort further on past the tourism season, but it may extend until May. Days get shorter. So to me, kind of the perfect season is like late February, early March. But you know, this is another thing that may well be changing. This season, we have no idea. Last season, there weren't a lot of whales on the peninsula until January, but the season before that was super early, October, November, we were seeing humpback whale sightings, which was like, I mean, we've had that in the California coast. Our season expanded and shifted as the population recovers. And I think that's likely that we'll see the same thing over time, is that what we think of as the norm is actually a bit of an artifact of less animals. And you know, they may come, you know, there may be a social factor in their gathering on the peninsula, that they're drawn to the presence of other individuals, especially since the krill swarms tend to be large enough. It's not limited, you know, like, oh, I'm not going to go there because there's other whales there. Rather, it's, you know, potentially attracted to the presence of other whales. So yeah, I would say, you know, on average, January onward. But yeah.
Right, thank you. Quite a lot of people have mentioned that they have photographs of whales they sighted in previous years. Can they still submit those to Happy Whale?
Please. Yeah, happywhale.com. It should be pretty easy. It's supposed to be. You know, mostly we want to know, you know, where were you, when were you there, and ideally who you were with, like what operator, what ship you're on. And it's all just a little sort of web form to submit stuff. And yeah, it's so fantastic what we've managed to pull together. So I really appreciate that effort. Leopard seal photos as well. And not just humpbacks. The humpbacks, what we're looking for is the underside of the tail when the whale is diving, but other species as well, and each have their respective, you know, which parts of the bodies are we looking for? And there's some guides to that if you click around a bit on the site. So yeah, awesome.
Oh, brilliant. Okay, and some other people have said that they obviously love to do this themselves. Are there particular operators and things that they should be looking at that to contribute to your project, or are all the ARTO vessel operators contributing?
Yeah, it's been pretty far and wide. And I mean, yes, some operators are better than others, but, you know, quite honestly, it actually varies more by like what expedition guides are aboard and who champions it aboard. So for every tour operator involved here on this trip, you know, listen to this, and I encourage you to have a citizen science coordinator aboard. You know, some have been really great with this. I'm not going to shout out favorites at this point, but it's a thing to ask, you know, when you're asking about a trip, is say, what do you do for citizen science aboard? Because, you know, some really do champion it, and some, but most operators, it seems, generally leave it to their guides to champion or not. And, you know, there's been a gradual shift, and it's really neat to see some making it more of a part of the program, because it's a lot of fun, and very rewarding.
Absolutely. Okay, then just a little bit look to the future, really. I mean, you've touched upon the impacts of things like climate change and things like that on whale populations. But could you comment? I mean, all of you, I suppose, comment on how you see the future of whales and their recovery in the southern oceans, but also what are the risks they're facing? So you might be thinking about climate change or plastic pollution or whaling, continued whaling, or indeed ginormous icebergs. I don't know who would like to go first on that one. Bjørn, do you want to kick off with that one?
Well, maybe it's a final remark, obviously. Well, you know, historians don't have much to say about the future, or they are very careful to say anything about the future, of course. But when it comes to the future of whaling, I don't think we should fear in the near future that there will be a sort of increase in that kind of industry. But you never know. I mean, historically, we know when there are resource scarcity in one way or another, economic and commercial and profit pressure tend to sort of win, which is, of course, disturbing. I may comment on a question really that came. I look at the question series here. One guy asks here if this mindset about claiming territories to protect hunting ground or resources, like the polar imperialism that we have experienced in the past, is that still an issue, or will it be an issue for the future? And well, there are not many territories to claim, of course, around, but it is still an issue, I would say. A parallel today is this interest in claiming continental shelves that we, of course, see in the Arctic, and we see it in the Antarctic as well. And that has, of course, everything to do with resources. It's about getting sort of hunting grounds and control of resources like krill or fisheries or specifically oil resources, of course, in the north. So that's very much a parallel, I would say, to what we have seen historically as well. Okay, yeah, thank you.
Bjørn, thank you. Ted, do you want to
comment on the future? Yeah, I mean, on the mass scale for Antarctic marine populations, it's to me, it's climate change, and everything else is not insignificant, but certainly a lot smaller. Like Jen says, you know, whales have a flexibility because of their mobility, right? So I would make the point, even as much as I love humpback whales, they are generalists, you know, and the other species, blue whales, need these krill concentrations. And the humpbacks tend to be very flexible. They will switch prey. They'll go to the same areas and they'll switch prey once they're there. Other species, not so much. So humpbacks are not actually the best ecological indicator. And I think what we have is climate change above all, but at the same time, we have to be very aware of, you know, how are we interacting with, especially, you know, vessel traffic. You know, globally, the biggest threats to cetaceans are, I think, entanglements, ship strikes, fisheries conservation, and climate change. In the Antarctic, climate change stands out. Ship strikes on the feeding grounds, relatively limited, and fortunately you have a pretty sensitive audience there, and which is that a lot of the shipping traffic is tourism, and tourism is very sensitive to this. So as long as there's awareness of it, we'll respond, and we're trying to put good science into that. entanglements in fishing gear for Antarctic whale populations, mostly only the case for breeding grounds where they're close to shore in lower latitude areas, such, and that's a real potential situation. It is, I think, not affecting these whale populations as much. Fisheries, I think, proactive good management of krill fisheries is super important, and because while the amount of harvesting right now is tiny, it could, and if it were to expand, you could have certain areas that get fished out because they're the areas that are most convenient to fish, and you also could have, like that combined with climate change. I mean, this is what happened with sardine fisheries around the world. Sardine fisheries grew and grew and grew, and then you had El Nino years where the fish population collapsed and the sardine fishery kept fishing, and then the population collapsed. And that's the story of the death of Monterey's sardine fishery. That's the story of Peru's death of Peru's sardine fishery. Maybe I'm generalizing, but yeah.
And Jennifer, reasons to be cheerful, optimistic, or are there still massive threats to whales? Sorry, you're on mute.
Yeah, there are threats, and I think Ted did a very nice job of listing the important ones. Certainly, whales in the northern hemisphere are having a much worse time of it than the whales in the southern hemisphere. They've been exploited for longer, and they've suffered more impacts from humans, arguably. But in the southern hemisphere, there are still things we have to really take care of. As Ted mentioned, of course, in the Southern Ocean, climate change is probably going to be one of the biggest drivers, because the amount of boats in the water mean that the risk of ship strikes and entanglement are a bit lower. I think that the positive aspects, if we can maintain safe, sustainable and precautionary, careful management of the Southern Ocean, it's going to be fine for whales, because they've managed to recover. When we stopped whaling and just left them to it, they've been doing well. As Ted said, humpback whales are generalists, but other species such as blue whales that rely on large quantities of krill, they seem to be coming back. But if we want to maintain that recovery, we just need to make sure that we are really proactive in developing good, careful, sustainable, precautionary management of the Southern Ocean ecosystems and of the key important sites for whales at lower latitudes, where they go when they're in the winter time in the Southern Hemisphere. Brilliant. But I think the prospect is good certainly for the Southern Ocean.
Fantastic, thank you. And that's a final question. Is I think the future of whale science. There's lots of science going on. We've heard about some amazing studies tonight. What's the future of whale science, and how is it going to impact whale recovery in whales, our understanding of whales in the future, do you think?
Well, in terms of whale recovery, it's really where whale science can be directed to help us make good, sustainable management decisions. So that means identifying important areas for whales and then saying, okay, we're going to limit the speed that ships travel in those areas, or we're going to limit the amount of ships that go in those areas. So that's where, for example, our science is really focused on how the numbers relate to marine protected areas. Looking at whale science in the future, there's increasing amounts of new technology, particularly remote data collection. So, for example, UAVs flying overhead of whales to collect samples, drones, and even satellite-based surveys, which we're doing at the British Antarctic Survey, to count whales from space. So there's new technology coming on board to try and understand whale recovery in non-invasive and remote ways. It gives us more different perspectives on the lives of whales that previously we really couldn't get at the scale and in the remote regions such as the Southern Ocean. So I think there's there's going to be a lot of different approaches, proliferation of new technology with artificial intelligence, as Ted described, and this kind of really big scale image analysis. But I think it's all for the good, because it's, for the most part in the Southern Ocean, it's really tasked towards trying to understand whale populations and then feed that into good quality management practice.
Great. And Ted, anything you'd like to add to that?
I think that's super well said, but yeah, I mean, I guess the only thing I could add to that is the general context, which is that the removal of whales from the world's oceans last century was done on the back of, as Bjørn said, too little, too late in terms of management, which was because of, you know, insufficient science. And if you look through any, look at the status statements of marine mammal species, one after another, it's insufficient data, insufficient data, insufficient data. And I don't think it's a good excuse anymore to say, oh, we just didn't know, you know. And quite frankly, it's a question of societal values, is do we invest in the science, right? So to me, you know, we're trying to be really creative to get what resources we can, go as far as we can go, but it is really a social decision of, do we invest in the science? Yeah, for me, I mean, it's pretty obvious that new technology is the key, because time at sea on traditional surveys, $50,000 a day for a vessel, those have a definite place. But in reality, you know, there hasn't been a single comprehensive marine mammal survey of the Antarctic Peninsula, for example, not one really. And so we need to complement that with every other route we can, and we need to value it on a broad social level. Yeah.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. We are 9 o'clock, so I think we've timed that perfectly. There are still some outstanding questions. What we'll do is we'll download all of those and we'll share them with the speakers. And if you have answers for those, we'll post those on social media. So thank you. But I'd like to thank all the speakers tonight for an absolutely tremendous evening. I think I've learned tons about whales and whale science and whale recovery. I go down when we can, go down the pub and tell people all about it. So tremendous. Thank you so much, Jen, Ted, and Bjørn, for taking the time out and sharing your expertise tonight. I don't know, Alison, if you want to say anything now, but I just want to say thank you, and that there will be more of these events coming up. Alison, I don't know if you want to add anything.
Well, I think thank you, Camilla, for fielding the many questions that we had. You did a fantastic job there. And I would just also like to say thank you to our US affiliate organisation, Friends of South George Island, which has worked so hard with us to support some of the work that you've heard from today. And I really hope that we can direct you to Happy Whale and to help support expeditions like Jen's in the future. So yeah, we really appreciate your support. Thank you so much.
We will have another event coming up in, just as a heads up, an event in June on the 24th, which will be a joint event between us and UKAHT and South Georgia Heritage Trust, which will be an evening and an auction in support of our work. So that should be a really fun evening. We'll be planning some more of these, so I hope you'll be able to join us. But for now, thank you all so very much for joining us. It was great to see you, and keep in touch. Thank you.